It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. She is Professor Nadine de Toit, Professor in Theology and Development and Head of the Department for Practical Theology and Missiology at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Stellenbosch in Cape Town. Nadine has published over 75 research articles and book chapters. Her research over the past 22 years has largely focused on the role of faith communities in addressing the intersecting issues of poverty, inequality, race, and gender. Besides lecturing, publishing, and supervising postgraduate students, she is often invited to address organizations, congregations, church leaders, and faith-based groups on topics pertaining to community development and social justice. She sees herself as an activist academic, always seeking to push for more space, for more voices to be heard. Nadine previously served as the chairperson of the Society of Practical Theology in South Africa and is the current president of the International Academy of Practical Theology. She's the director of the Unit for Religion and Development at the University of Stellenbosch Faculty of Theology and serves on the board of several faith-based non-profit organizations, including Micah Global member, The Warehouse, where she has served for many years. And as such, Nadine is part of our family. She's a long-term friend and member of Micah and a pioneer globally in the field of Christian transformational development. So thank you, Nadine, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I guess that's my cue. That sounds like a rather intimidating CV. I don't know if I'll be able to live up to all of that. I don't think it's 75 articles. I probably a typo there in my bio. More like
it was meant to be 45, so it's probably a slip of the tongue on me. My paper said 45, so if I said 75, maybe it's prophetic. You know, it's prophetic. So keep going.
Yes. We'll. I'm a good Pentecostal, everybody. So I'll claim that one. All right, friends. So let me just try and share my screen. Okay, let's hope that's the right screen. We can all see that, right?
Yes, yeah.
Let me just check. And now it's not moving. Some strange reason. Okay, let me just use the other tool. There we go. All right. So I think it's really important. This is very short, as Deborah has already alluded to. You know, this is a much longer and larger conversation. So I think that for many of you, it may be unsatisfactory in terms of covering all the bases, but I hope that it is just going to be a way or a window into the conversation that we had. Before we allowed you all into the room, I said, to Fiona that I think the most stimulating and the best way to learn is by engaging with each other. And so I'm really also hoping to learn from some of you this afternoon, your own experiences, even in your questions and in your wrestling within your various organizations. And I really count it a privilege to be with Micah this afternoon. So in terms of the short presentation, I want to frame it in terms of story. And, they say there is no single story. That has, in fact, been one of the problems around colonialism, that we come with a single story. But in development, we know also that there is no single story. So I want to start with my own story very briefly. I'm not going to give a whole long thing. And then looking at the colonial story, because the mission enterprise has, in fact, shaped much of what we do today and much of how we think around development, often in colonial ways because of its historical undergirding. And then perhaps storing the challenges and then rewriting the story. And I'm sincerely hoping this is the right presentation. Can I just check it quickly? I think it is the right one. One often has multiple presentations. So as a practical theologian, it's always important. And I think it's in decolonial praxis, one of the things that's really important is to position ourselves and to really declare who we are and where we come from. So I come from South Africa. I was born and raised in Cape Town. And my journey at this intersection of faith development and the decolonial really came as a result of being the child of what I would call politically conscious and very activistic, and this sounds funny maybe to some of you, Pentecostal clergy. My dad was back in the day, and the picture to the left at the top, you'll see a man, a very small man standing on a building. When I was a child, I thought that all ministers wore blue overalls and worked on buildings because my dad was a minister in a very poor congregation and saw really the need for the church to be holistic in its approach to development. And so this building actually is standing not far from our home where I live currently, and was actually built as a community center, not only as a church. So that's where I come from. And I think it's important for me to name check people like Craig Stewart, who are in the room today. My own journey, I'm an academic, so I'm not sure whether I have all the knowledge, but I continue to learn by, and from radical Christian development practitioners who are grappling with and pioneering new ways of doing what we call development. Some may even question the very term development itself, which we may not get to that today. I'm just realizing in my presentation, but I'm just going to throw that in as part of it. So we have to start with the story of colonialism. So I think for some of you, it may be, well, what's colonialism got to do with any of this? It's done, it's finished. In South Africa, people will often say, oh, let's just move on from apartheid. Why must we always be talking about apartheid? And I would say with some, it's the same is, why must we always be talking about colonialism? It's in the past. But you'll hear why I make the argument that it's really important for us to acknowledge the role that it plays. So we know that most of the time, the role of Christianity in terms of development, welfare infrastructure, during the colonial era, things like hospitals, schools, etc., were built as a result often of the missionary enterprise. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge the role that missionaries played in opposing oppressive colonial interests. So that's the positive side of it. Unfortunately, sadly, it's also no secret that missionary Christianity accompanied colonial expansion in much of the global South. And therefore, not all, of course, we had the hashtag not all, but at times went hand in hand with the practices and the thinking, I would say, of oppressive colonial powers. So decolonizing is a response to colonialism, maybe not in the physical sense as we understand it today, but more colonial thinking, practices, worldviews that still exist in development today. And we have to understand that Christianity is sadly entangled with this because of the entanglement of the missionary enterprise in certain sectors of the global South with colonialism, but also that Christianity's, development's foundations was often built on missionary colonial enterprise in many countries. And there's a lovely article by Mangiano Coyle called The Missionary Position. It was published in 2002, but it really is quite an interesting article in terms of, talking about how these two industries later were interlinked. Now, so in some ways, I think Christianity or the church affirmed both kind of the positive and the negative practices that were still rooted in the colonial missionary project. Of course, the negative things such as paternalism, ignoring indigenous spiritualities, cooperating with colonial oppressors in the abuse and degradation of indigenous people, the degradation of nature or domination of nature, and of course, positive values too. I mean, the Christian faith also brought things such as affirmation of human dignity, of course, the affirmation of spirituality, and as I already said, the establishment of soft infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, etc., for which we know. So what is this thing called decolonization? And I think there are many ways of defining it. So please don't see the way I'm relating it today as the ultimate way of understanding it, but essentially it is a response to colonialism and colonial practices that still exist in mission and development work today. Of course, I've also mentioned the church as a development actor is rooted historically in the missionary enterprise, so we cannot ignore this. And very often we might say, as I said, colonialism is done. We have nothing to do with that. We've moved on. But decoloniality presents a mirror to us and says, well, have we really? Do we still behave and act? Are there ways in which we still behave and act in a way that mimics some of these, or mirrors some of these colonial missionary thinking and worldviews? So in decolonizing development, we are not talking about a complete rejection of the Western praxis of development, but we are talking about the recentering of development. So we're wanting to reject a kind of Western praxis of development, often where the power and the money is, that it should be the sole departure point in development practice, right? So it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as Chidimbembe says. It's not closing the door to Europeans or Americans or the West and saying, oh, well, you're not important anymore. It's saying, what is the center? When we do work in the global South or in the majority world, whatever you want to call it, who is being centered in this work? Mignolo is a famous decolonial scholar, and he says that the grammar of decoloniality, the language of decoloniality, has to work from the bottom up. And I think for many development workers, it's like, yes, of course. I mean, we talk about bottom-up development, we talk about grassroots development, but sometimes this is something we claim, but we do not practice. And I think the decolonial debate brings the attention back to that notion. So I'm not gonna, we talk about a theology of decoloniality. I'm not going to make any grand claims. I'm literally just going to throw this out there in the sense that I've been reflecting. So what is the key thing in here? Not any grand theology, but I like to think of Philippians 2. It's one of my favorite scriptures, and I think it's one of the most challenging in many ways to those of us that are wanting to do incarnational work, right? Deep incarnational work. There's no words such as decolonization in the Bible or in scripture, but for me, in Philippians 2, we see talk about self-emptying, or what theologians like to talk about as kenosis. And I feel that for me, Christian development work should be kenotic, self-emptying. That's almost a deeper concept to me than how we understand somebody serving us. And it relates to power and position. And I think in Christ as our ultimate example, in Philippians 2, we see this notion of an absolute servant, our powerful God coming to earth and then emptying himself of power. And this stands in stark opposition, I think, if you think of the context of that time, to the empire and how they viewed power at that specific time. Colonization, of course, is also built on the notion of empire and the perpetuation of empire. And empire, and therefore colonization, was all about self-serving and domination, just like in Jesus's time, building wealth on the backs of poor people, enslaved people, subjugated people, in lands that were not their own. So decolonization is an attempt at recentering those places and peoples whose voices were excluded both historically and now in the colonial project. Because, of course, we continue to perpetuate, sadly, we don't learn our lessons, continue to perpetuate some of these patterns and ways of thinking even today. So for me, the challenge is our Christian development praxis really kenotic? Is it really self-emptying? Does it recognize notions of power and empire? Or is it centering dominant and often Western ways of doing development as the best, the West being best. So I think for me also, Jesus' engagement was always dignifying and recentering the story from the powerful towards the powerless, towards those who would have had less power in that time. If you will, Robert Chambers, I'm sure some of you would have read him, but if you haven't, he's one of, we talk about, well, not me, but my child would talk about the OG, the original gangster, the original sort of person who development practitioner and scholar who wrote a book called Putting the Last First. It's a development book. I don't think he's a Christian, but this is a kingdom logic, if you will. We don't need Robert Chambers actually to tell us that, but thank you, Robert Chambers, nevertheless, for reminding us. So I don't need to go into Philippians 2. I'm not going to do any exegesis. I might do eisegesis for those that are theologians. So please let me not go down that path. But I think for me, this is a very confronting text, also in terms of self-reflexivity, which is something that in decolonial praxis, we also want to encourage. How do we think about ourselves? How do we think about our positioning? Even for me as a woman of color in South Africa, I still have a lot of power and relative wealth to the rest of the population. How do I think about my positioning when doing this kind of work? So some colonial assumptions that should be challenged. So I think often we unthinkingly take on what I would call problematic old style missionary assumptions. And this is not a critique against anybody who works in a missionary organization. I just want to tell you that. This is just about talking about the history of the missionary enterprise itself. It's not a reflection on you specifically or your work. But what is it that, we've imbibed from kind of colonial missionary? I think the first one, which has to do with dualistic spirituality, most of us don't subscribe to that. As Christian development workers, many of you would say, no, of course. I mean, the Bible doesn't promote dualism, integral mission, and spirituality is deeply entwined and essential, actually, in development work. So I think for most of us, perhaps we could disabuse ourselves of that notion. The second one is missionary assumption was that we had to decenter the culture of those we were working with, and we actually need to center their culture and their social capital and their cultural capitals, because in the missionary enterprise, Western knowledge systems and ways of doing and thinking were elevated as superior. West is best, influenced by notions of linear progress, the modernization theory, and that really needs to be challenged. We can think about Jesus' challenging of the empire at that time. And then something a little bit maybe more controversial for some of you, I think the notion that everything can be quantitatively measured by positivistic measurements. I'm not anti-M&E, although I am against the thingification or the projectization of people. And I think that's a trap that we can fall into, which actually is premised on this Western empire-like way of doing and thinking. And then, of course, the famous divorcing the ecological from development. So I'll just skip to rewriting the story. I always put a question mark because I'm just going to throw some things out there and we are going to discuss and fill some of those things in. And I pray that you will think about this also in your own context. So you don't have to imbibe everything that I say, but think about what does this look like in my context? Because I'm specifically will talk from my own context. So I think firstly, when we talk about decolonizing, it starts with critically reflecting on our own praxis and attitudes. Are we like colonial missionaries in our engagement with those we serve? I'm sure immediately many of you are going, no, 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 no. But this takes long and hard reflection and discernment and an honest look in the mirror. And I believe as Christians, much prayerful engagement. I often say to my students, remember that there's only one Savior, and that's Jesus. And they laugh at me and they think it's funny, but I'm very serious. Do we see ourselves as saviors? Yes, we're called. Yes, we believe in what we're doing. But when we enter a space, How do we enter it? And that could be us individually, but that could also be reflecting on our organizational positionality and positioning towards, particularly when we're coming into a space that socioeconomically is marginalized, also the culturally, etc. And then, of course, basics, affirming the human dignity of those you serve, recognizing them as being made in the image of God. Easy things to say. Yes, of course, we can tick. But these are really, really difficult questions if you start to think about how Jesus saw those that he interacted with. Very challenging when I always read the Gospels as a mirror. In development, of course, we talk about putting people first. In South Africa, in Sesotho, we talk about Batopele, and our government even, social development talks about that. But do we do that? I like Brian Myers is talking about acknowledging that everywhere is holy. Everywhere we step, everywhere we go is holy. God is already at work in those spaces. We are entering spaces, even if they look God-forsaken, God is working, and we're joining God in what God's already doing in that particular space. And then, of course, recognizing and understanding the spirituality and culture of the people we're serving with. Many of you say, oh, well, we do this, but do we do it? So these are some of the questions I'm wanting to probe, thinking about ways in which land and ecology are linked to the work we do. In many African spirituality, for example, land, spirituality, and ecology are inextricably linked. And for someone like me, who's very westernized and urban, it's very difficult for me to actually understand that unless I'm really listening, being in the space, spending time, and acknowledging that. This is a now defunct Instagram account, Barbie Savior, #, go and check it out. I'm not going to go much into it, but it's a parody account on saviorism, if you will, within the development sector. Another one, of course, is for us to challenge neoliberal modes of development. Whose development is really being forwarded or fronted in the work that we're doing? Is it the people's development? Or is it something that our donors or our strategic plans have told us we should be doing? How do we equalize partnerships? We need to acknowledge power in development. I think a lot of people write on this. Myers also writes on this. Centering the community rather than the donor as the locus of community development. Promoting notions like self-reliance. Can maybe tell a story or two, but these are hard things. These require us to work ourselves out of jobs. Then, of course, we know about ABCD, assets-based community development. Excuse me, this is the long, hard work that many of you are doing, helping people to identify or ask, like God did Moses, what do you have in your hand? And they're not just shoving things in their hand. These are things you all know, but maybe for us to really reflect very carefully. And then often recognizing the unrecognizable. When we buy into a very global development speak and industry, if you will, often we don't recognize what God is already doing on the ground. What things that don't look like development may actually be for the flourishing of those communities, for the shalom of those communities, which are embedded in their indigenous ways of being and doing, and which we may just overlook because we're looking for projects and outcomes and whatever else. So we're looking for those little mustard seeds. And then something I learned from Craig, complex systems thinking versus linear outcomes thinking. And I think it's really important. Very often we talk about best practice. I sincerely do not like the word best practice in development. It implies replication, that we can just take what we're doing in Asia and then we go to Africa and we just do the same thing over there and surely it will work because it worked in Asia. And that's really not very contextual. And then one that might be a little bit more controversial. Some of you may recognize this picture, those that come from South Africa. This is part of the story of Beautiful Gate, which is quite a large community development-based Christian organization in Cape Town, South Africa. And just very beautiful to see how there was a transition from Alke and Toby Brouwer on the left-hand side, also Vaughan to the right of Minor in the middle, who's the current CEO. Alke and Toby founded the organization as missionaries, but just seeing how that there's been this wonderful leadership transition that has been beautiful and honoring on both sides, and also of the culture within which Beautiful Gate is positioned and placed. Acknowledging Indigenous leadership, Minor actually was born in the township where Beautiful Gate is and now leads together with Vaughan, who actually was the previous CEO. And so I think that's one thing. So we can talk about that. And then removing the dependency mentality and addressing power dynamics and internalized oppression. This is a big one. So I could be a person of color working in a development organization, but I could think in very Western and colonized ways. It does not mean just because you have people of color in your organization, firstly, it's not good to place on them all the responsibility to make these changes or to be pro-decolonization. But secondly, many of them may themselves have been trained and worked in a very colonial system, right? The development enterprise. And so I call that internalized oppression, where we ourselves need to be thinking and reflecting some more also on our own positionality, maybe in terms of socioeconomic wealth, but also in terms of what have we imbibed and what are we perpetuating. So in terms of leadership, inverting leadership hierarchies or cultural domination, thinking about what does this incarnational ethic mean, or this kenotic ethic in the Christian tradition, and how do we value Indigenous resources and values and ways of being and doing? How do we center the usually marginal voices in organizational structures, which sometimes is the so-called diverse other? And how do we learn to name the powers and power? And I believe, I'm a Pentecostal, you heard me make a joke about that. The work we do is deeply spiritual, and there is definite opposition from the evil one who does not want communities to flourish and stands against the very values of the kingdom. And so we have to recognize power and the way it manifests itself. And I see that spiritually and, of course, physically, and in terms of power hierarchies and structures. And then, okay, this is a book edited by, I don't like the fact it's edited, I'm in it, but it's edited by Germans. Yeah, that's where the power lies, right? And the money. Anyway, so I think exploring Indigenous, I do like the book though, because I like the other contributors and what they bring to the table. But exploring Indigenous concepts and understandings, decentering Western and donor-centric development, speak even. How do we speak about the work we do? What kind of language do we use? And then recognizing all culture is fallen, including Western culture, but culture is also God-given. How do we recognize those God-given aspects of the cultures within which we work, rather than simply focusing on the negative ones, which often become a barrier, I think, to development, and we become tired and frustrated and start, speaking badly about the people that we work with because we get frustrated, and it's process kind of work. But still to be focusing, this is a God-given culture. There may be fallen aspects, but what is God created in this culture, in these people, in my fellow development workers, where they're coming from, acknowledging that beauty, that diversity, that wisdom that they bring as God created. I'm not going to go into the example there. I think the 15 minutes is up. But I think rather just allow time for more conversation. I know I rushed it. I talk very fast, and my accent might not be so understandable to everybody, but hopefully we can have good conversation and understand each other more, and the actual concept more as we engage. Thanks, everybody.